Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we are reading Chapter 2 of Sabriel. Let's get right into it today. I'm ready to read. Okay. Chapter 2. The perimeter in Encelstier ran from coast to coast, parallel to the wall, and perhaps half a mile from it. Concertina wire lay like worms impaled on rusting steel pickets, forward defenses for an interlocking network of trenches and concrete pillboxes. Many of these strong points were designed to control the ground behind them, as well as in front, and almost as much barbed wire stretched behind the trenches, guarding the rear. In fact, the perimeter was much more successful at keeping people from Ancelstier out of the Old Kingdom than it was at preventing things from the Old Kingdom going the other way. Anything powerful enough to cross the wall usually retained enough magic to assume the shape of a soldier, or to become invisible and simply go where it willed, regardless of barbed wire, bullets, hand grenades, and mortar bombs, which often didn't work at all, particularly when the wind was blowing from the north, out of the Old Kingdom. Due to the unreliability of technology, the Ancelstieren soldiers of the perimeter garrison wore mail over their khaki battle dress, had nasal and neck bars on their helmets, and carried extremely old-fashioned sword bayonets in well-worn scabbards. Shields, or more correctly, bucklers, small perimeter garrison only, were carried on their backs, the factory khaki long since submerged under brightly painted regimental or personal signs. Camouflage was not considered an issue at this particular posting. Sabriel watched a platoon of young soldiers march past the bus, while she waited for the tourists ahead of her to stampede out the front door, and wondered what they thought of their strange duties. Most would have to be conscripts from far to the south, where no magic crept over the wall, and widened the cracks in what they thought of as reality. Here she could feel magic potential brewing, lurking in the atmosphere, like charged air before a thunderstorm. The wall itself looked normal enough, past the wasteland of wire and trenches, just like any other medieval remnant. It was stone and old, about 40 feet high, and crenellated. Nothing remarkable until the realization set in that it was in a perfect state of preservation. And for those with the sight, the very stones crawled with charter marks, marks in constant motion, twisting and turning, sliding and rearranging themselves under a skin of stone. The final confirmation of strangeness lay beyond the wall. It was clear and cool on the Ancelstier side, and the sun was shining, but Sabriel could see snow falling steadily behind the wall, and snow-heavy clouds clustered right up to the wall, where they suddenly stopped, as if some mighty weather knife had simply sheared through the sky. Sabriel watched the snow fall, and gave thanks for her almanac. Printed by letterpress, the type had left ridges in the thick, lined, linen-rich paper, making the many handwritten annotations waver precariously between the lines. One spidery remark, written in a hand she knew wasn't her father's, gave the weather to be expected under the respective calendars for each country. Encelstier had autumn, likely to be cool. The Old Kingdom had winter, bound to be snowing, skis, or snowshoes. The last tourist left, eager to reach the observation platform. Although the army and the government discouraged tourists, and there was no accommodation for them within 20 miles of the wall, one busload a day was allowed to come and view the wall from a tower located well behind the lines of the perimeter. Even this concession was often canceled, for when the wind blew from the north, the bus would inexplicably break down a few miles short of the tower, and the tourists would have to help push it back towards Bain, only to see it start again just as mysteriously as it had stopped. The authorities also made some slight allowance for the few people authorized to travel from Ancelstier to the Old Kingdom, as Sabriel saw after she had successfully negotiated the bus's steps with her backpack, cross-country skis, stocks, and sword, all threatening to go in different directions. A large sign next to the bus stop proclaimed, "Perimeter Command, Northern Army Group. Unauthorized egress from the perimeter zone is strictly forbidden. Anyone attempting to cross the perimeter zone will be shot without warning. Authorized travelers must report to the Perimeter Command HQ. Remember, no warning will be made." Sabriel read the note with interest, and felt a quickening sense of excitement start within her. Her memories of the Old Kingdom were dim, from the perspective of a child, but she felt a sense of mystery and wonder kindle with the force of the charter magic she felt around her, a sense of something so much more alive than the bitumened parade ground and the scarlet warning sign, and much more freedom than Waverly College. But that feeling of wonder and excitement came laced with a dread that she couldn't shake, a dread made up of fear for what might be happening to her father, what might have already happened. The arrow on the sign indicating where authorized travelers should go seemed to point in the direction of a bitumen parade ground, lined with white-painted rocks and a number of unprepossessing wooden buildings. Other than that, they were simply the beginnings of the communication trenches that sank into the ground and then zigzagged their way to the double line of trenches, blockhouses, and fortifications that confronted the wall. Sabriel studied them for a while and saw the flash of color as several soldiers hopped out of the trench and went forward to the wire. They seemed to be carrying spears rather than rifles, and she wondered why the perimeter was built for modern war, but manned by people expecting something rather more medieval. Then she remembered a conversation with her father, and his comment that the perimeter had been designed far away in the south, where they refused to admit that this perimeter was different from any other contested border. Up until a century or so ago, there had also been a wall on the Ancelstier side, a lowish wall made of rammed earth and peat, but a successful one. Recalling that conversation, her eyes made out a low rise of scarred earth in the middle of the desolation of wire, and she realized that was where the southern wall had been. Peering at it, she also realized that what she had taken to be loose pickets between lines of concertina wire were something different. Tall constructs more like the trunks of small trees stripped of every branch. They seemed familiar to her, but she couldn't place what they were. Sabriel was still staring at them, thinking, when a loud and not very pleasant voice erupted a little way behind her right ear. "What do you think you're doing, miss? You can't loiter about here. On the bus, or up to the tower." Sabriel winced and turned as quickly as she could, skis sliding one way and stocks the other, framing her head in a St. Andrew's cross. The voice belonged to a large but fairly young soldier, whose bristling mustaches were more evidence of martial ambition than proof of them. He had 2 gilded bands on his sleeve, but didn't wear the mail hauberk and helmet Sabriel had seen on the other soldiers. He smelled of shaving cream and talc, and was so clean, polished, and full of himself that Sabriel immediately catalogued him as some sort of natural bureaucrat currently disguised as a soldier. "I am a citizen of the Old Kingdom," she replied quietly, staring back into his red-flushed face and piggy eyes in a manner which Miss Prionette had taught her girls to instruct lesser domestic servants in etiquette for. "I am returning there." "Papers!" demanded the soldier, after a moment's hesitation at the words Old Kingdom. Sabriel gave a frosty smile, also a part of Miss Prionette's curriculum, and made a ritual movement with the tips of her fingers, the symbol of disclosing, of things hidden becoming seen, of unfolding. As her fingers sketched, she formed the symbol in her mind, linking it with the papers she carried in the inner pocket of her leather tunic. Fingers sketched, and mind-drawn symbol merged, and the papers were in her hand. An Ancelstier passport, as well as the much rarer document the Ancelstier Perimeter Command issued to people who had traffic in both countries. A hand-bound document, printed by letterpress on handmade paper, with an artist's sketch instead of a photograph, and prints from thumbs and toes in a purple ink. The soldier blinked but said nothing. Perhaps, thought Sabriel, as he took the proffered documents, the man thought it was a parlor trick, or perhaps he just didn't notice. Maybe charter magic was common here, so close to the wall. The man looked through her documents carefully, but without real interest. Sabriel now felt certain that he was no one important from the way he pawed through her special passport. He'd obviously never seen one before. Mischievously, she started to weave the charter mark for a snatch, or catch, to flick the papers out of his hands and back into her pocket before his piggy eyes worked out what was going on. But in the first second of motion, she felt the flare of another charter magic to either side and behind her, and heard the clattering of hobnails on the bitumen. Her head snapped back from the papers, and she felt her hair whisk across her forehead as she looked from side to side. Soldiers were pouring out of the huts and out of the trenches, sword bayonets in their hands and rifles at the soldier. Several of them wore badges that she realized marked them as charter mages. Their fingers were weaving warding symbols and barriers that would lock Sabriel into her footsteps, tie her to her shadow. Crude magic, but strongly cast. Instinctively, Sabriel's mind and hands flashed into the sequence of symbols that would wipe clean these bonds, but her skis shifted and fell into the crook of her elbow, and she winced at the blow. At the same time, a soldier ran ahead of the others, sunlight glinting on the silver stars on his helmet. "Stop!" he shouted. "Corporal, step back from her!" The corporal, deaf to the hum of charter magic, blind to the flare of half-wrought signs, looked up from her papers and gaped for a second, fear erasing his features. He dropped the passports and stumbled back. In his face, Sabriel suddenly realized what it meant to use magic on the perimeter, and she held herself absolutely still, blanking out the partly made signs in her mind. Her skis slipped further down her arm, the bindings catching for a moment before tearing loose and clattering onto the ground. Soldiers rushed forward and in seconds formed a ring around her, swords angled towards her throat. She saw streaks of silver plated onto the blades and crudely written charter symbols and understood. These weapons were made to kill things that were already dead, inferior versions of the sword she wore at her own side. The man who'd shouted, an officer, Sabriel realized, bent down and picked up her passports. He studied them for a moment, then looked up at Sabriel. His eyes were pale blue and held a mixture of harshness and compassion that Sabriel found familiar, though she couldn't place it, till she remembered her father's eyes. Abhorsen's eyes were so dark brown they seemed black, but they held a similar feeling. The officer closed the passport, tucked it in his belt, and tilted his helmet back with 2 fingers, revealing a charter mark still glowing with some residual charm of warding. Cautiously, Sabriel lifted her hand, and then, as he didn't dissuade her, reached out with 2 fingers to touch the mark. As she did so, he reached forward and touched her own. Sabriel felt the familiar swirl of energy and the feeling of falling into some endless galaxy of stars. But the stars here were charter symbols, linked in some great dance that had no beginning or end, but contained and described the world in its movement. Sabriel knew only a small fraction of the symbols, but she knew what they danced, and she felt the purity of the charter wash over her. "An unsullied charter mark," the officer pronounced loudly, as their fingers fell back to their sides. "She is no creature or sending." The soldiers fell back, sheathing swords and clicking on safety catches. Only the red-faced corporal didn't move, his eyes still staring at Sabriel, as if he was unsure what he was looking at. "Show's over, Corporal," said the officer, his voice and eyes now harsh. "Get back to the pay office. You'll see stranger things than this in your time here. Stay clear of them, and you might stay alive." "So," he said, taking the documents from his belt and handing them back to Sabriel. "You are the daughter of Abhorsen. I'm Colonel Horace, the commander of a small part of the garrison here, a unit the Army likes to call the Northern Perimeter Reconnaissance Unit, and everyone else calls the Crossing Point Scouts, a somewhat motley collection of Ancestarians who've managed to gain a charter mark and some small knowledge of magic." "Pleased to meet you, sir," popped out of Sabriel's school-trained mouth, before she could stifle it. A schoolgirl's answer, she knew, and felt a blush rise in her pale cheeks. "Likewise," said the colonel, bending down. "May I take your skis?" "If you would be so kind," said Sabriel, falling back on formality. The colonel picked them up with ease, carefully retied the stocks to the skis, refastened the bindings that had come undone, and tucked the lot under one muscular arm. "I take it you intend to cross into the Old Kingdom?" asked Horace, as he found the balancing point of his load, and pointed at the scarlet sign on the far side of the parade ground. "We'll have to check in with Perimeter HQ. There are a few formalities, but it shouldn't take long. Is someone, Abhorsen, coming to meet you?" His voice faltered a little as he mentioned Abhorsen, a strange stutter in so confident a man. Sabriel glanced at him and saw that his eyes flickered from the sword at her waist to the bell bandolier she wore across her chest. Obviously, he recognized Abhorsen's sword, and also the significance of the bells. Very few people ever met a necromancer, but anyone who did remembered the bells. Do you know my father?" she asked. "He used to visit me twice a year. I guess he would have come through here." "Yes, I saw him then," replied Horace, as they started walking around the edge of the parade ground. But I first met him more than 20 years ago, when I was posted here as a subaltern. It was a strange time, a very bad time, for me and everyone on the perimeter." He paused in mid-stride, boots crashing, and his eyes once again looked at the bells, and the whiteness of Sabriel's skin, stark against the black of her hair, black as the bitumen under her feet. "You're a necromancer," he said bluntly, "so you'll probably understand. This crossing point has seen too many battles, too many dead. Before those idiots down south took things under Central Command, the crossing point was moved every 10 years, up to the next gate on the wall. But 40 years ago, some bureaucrat decreed that there would be no movement. It was a waste of public money. This was, and is to be, the only crossing point. Never mind the fact that over time there would be such a concentration of death mixed with free magic leaking over the wall that everything would not stay dead," interrupted Sabriel quietly. "Yes. When I arrived, the trouble was just beginning. Corpses wouldn't stay buried. Our people, or our old kingdom creatures, soldiers killed the day before would turn up on parade. Creatures prevented from crossing would rise up and do more damage than they did when they were alive." "What did you do?" asked Sabriel. She knew a great deal about binding and enforcing true death, but not on such a scale. There were no dead creatures nearby now, for she always instinctively felt the interface between life and death around her, and it was no different here than it had been 40 miles away at Wyverley College. Our charter mages try to deal with the problem, but there were no specific charter symbols to make them dead, only to destroy their physical shape. Sometimes that was enough and sometimes it wasn't. We had to rotate troops back to Bane, or even further, just for them to recover from what HQ liked to think of as bouts of mass hysteria and madness. I wasn't a charter mage then, but I was going with patrols into the Old Kingdom, beginning to learn. On one patrol, we met a man sitting by a charter stone, on top of a hill that overlooked both the wall and the perimeter. As he was obviously interested in the perimeter, the officer in charge of the patrol thought we should question him, and kill him if he turned out to bear a corrupted charter, or was some free magic thing in the shape of a man. But we didn't, of course. It was Abhorsen, and he was coming to us because he'd heard about the dead. We escorted him in, and he met with the general commanding the garrison. I don't know what they agreed, but I imagine it was for Abhorsen to bind the dead, and in return he was to be granted citizenship of Ancelstier and freedom to cross the wall. He certainly had the 2 passports after that. In any case, he spent the next few months carving the wind flutes you can see among the wire. "Ah!" exclaimed Sabriel. "I wondered what they were. Wind flutes. That explains a lot." "I'm glad you understand," said the colonel. "I still don't. For one thing, they make no sound no matter how hard the wind blows through them. They have charter symbols on them, and they have charter symbols on them I had never seen before he carved them, and have never seen again anywhere else. But when he started placing them, one night the dead just gradually disappeared and no new ones rose." They reached the far end of the parade ground, where another scarlet sign stood next to the communication trench, proclaiming, "Perimeter Garrison HQ, call and wait for sentry." The telephone handset and a bell chain proclaimed the usual dichotomy of the perimeter. Colonel Horace picked up the handset, wound the handle, listened for a moment, then replaced it. Frowning, he pulled the bell chain 3 times in quick succession. "Anyway," he continued, as they waited for the sentry, "whatever it was, it worked. So we're deeply indebted to Abhorsen, and that makes his daughter an honored guest." "I may be less honored and more reviled as the messenger of ill omens," said Sabriel quietly. She hesitated, for it was hard to talk about Abhorsen without tears coming to her eyes, then continued quietly, to get over and done with. "The reason I'm going into the Old Kingdom is to look for my father. Something has happened to him." "I'd hoped there was another reason for you to carry his sword," said Horace. He moved the skis into the crook of his left arm, freeing his right, to return the salute of the 2 sentries who were running at the double up the communication trench. Hobnails clacking on the wooden slats. "There's worse, I think," added Sabriel, taking a deep breath to stop her voice from breaking into sobs. "He's trapped in death, or Or he may even be dead, and his bindings will be broken. The wind flutes? Asked Horace, grounding the ends of the skis, his salute dying out halfway to his head. All the dead here? The flutes play a song only heard in death, replied Sabriel, continuing a binding laid down by Abhorsen, but the bounder tied to him, and the flutes will have no power if Abhorsen is now among the dead. They will bind no more. And that is the end of chapter 2. Well, thank you for listening. That was a tough one to read. If you like this reading, please like, comment, and subscribe. I would love for you to comment if you've read this before, or just if you're enjoying it, what you think. I'd love to know. I hope you have a great day, and may your magic manifest. Bye.